What are the top 10 Japanese novels of all time? Novels that will not only entertain you, not only blow your mind, but also transform your life. And my name is Ian, and here on Right Conscious, we talk about the best books and authors of all time. I also help authors and readers, just like you, yes, you, activate so that we can create a literary renaissance and we can continue to support authors to create beautiful novels like the ones we will be talking about today. And more importantly, helping get those novels out into the hands of the masses. And so if you want to support my mission and get cool book recommendations in a fiery and bombastic way, then please consider subscribing and supporting the channel. And so screw that intro. I want to talk about some books, everyone. That's the hard part. Now I get to let the spirit take me over because we are going to be talking about one of my favorite Japanese authors of all time, if not my favorite first and foremost, a Mr. Yukio, Mishima. And I already have over 25 videos, yes, 25 videos on this channel covering Mishima's life, books, philosophy, and so much more if you want to go check out that playlist. I also have over 100 videos on Japanese literature and authors if you want to go check those out also. And so, man, this is a hard choice because I don't want to stack the deck. I feel like if this was a true top 10 list, multiple Mishima novels would make it, but I will only give each author one book. But within Mishima's bibliography, this was a very hard selection because I feel like his Sea of Fertility tetralogy, especially the first two novels, Spring Snow and Runaway Horses, are probably his best works, but having to ask you guys to embark on a series, especially to get to Runaway Horses, which I think is his best novel, is kind of a big ask. And so instead, we are going to focus on the kind of shorter and easier to get into Temple of the Golden Pavilion, which clocks in at 262 pages. And this book is going to set you on fire. This book is Aesthetic Terrorism 101. This is Mishima's crazy vision brought to life with a historical component. And so as I've talked about on this channel before, and maybe if you go check out, if I remember, I'll link it below, Why You Don't Need a Plot to Write a Good Novel, I think the title of the video is. I talk about how you don't necessarily need to be good at making plots to be a great author, because people like Shakespeare almost never, outside of 3 or 4 plays, made up his plots. He just took things from history and dramatized it. And the same goes for people like Cormac McCarthy, with his masterpiece Blood Meridian, which is just a retelling of history, or Yukio Mishima and the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, which tells the story of a young acolyte, a young Buddhist acolyte named Mizoguchi. And so Mishima took this story from an incident that happened a couple years before he started to write this in Japan, a huge deal. And the reason why this is so smart and this novel is so good is that Mishima's theories on beauty, the tear of aesthetics. Mizoguchi is kind of psychically disformed, right? And people perceive him kind of as a weirdo because he has this crazy stutter. And I've been an English teacher now for 7 or 8 years. I think this is maybe year 8, starting to lose track. And something that I've kind of seen is all types of problems. You know, that's kind of what you see as a public servant, all types of people. And like, it's honestly kind of jarring. You know, I had a student who had a stuttering problem that bad, and I'm pretty open-minded and chill, but it was like really alarming. And it took a while for me to get over it. And I would say I'm pretty kind and open-minded, and I know a lot of other people, including teachers, who couldn't ever really figure that out. I'd be like, okay, I'm just gonna sit here and let you get this message out, even if it takes 5 minutes. Like, who gives a fuck? Put your phone away, Johnny. And speaking of being a teacher, I run the most active and hardcore book club in the world. We read anywhere from 6 to 10 transformative novels every single month, and many of which are Japanese literature. We've read Mishima's entire bibliography as a group over the past year and are going to continue to read Japanese authors. And so if you head on over to my Substack, which is the home of the Literary Renaissance, you will see a ton of exclusive content that I cannot post over here on YouTube or is just way too in-depth or cool. For instance, I have a Confessions of a Mask book course right here that's over 40 minutes long. And all of the content is available on video and on audio so that you can listen without having to keep the screen open. And so here are some of the book clubs that we are doing this month. We got Infinite Jest, Dostoevsky, Pynchon, and so many others. And I have the schedule for August and September already out, where we will be reading even more classics. And so I have literature courses, writing courses, my own writing. I do a lot of translations of Chinese poetry and actually Japanese poetry over there. And so if you guys want to support this channel, support my mission of creating a literary renaissance, there is no better place to do that than on Substack. I would encourage you guys to go check out Substack in general, not just for my content, because the best writers of all genres and the best readers in the world are all over there, right now posting their stuff. I also have free content on my Substack. And so I don't take brand deals. I just talk about my own Substack. I will be releasing t-shirts soon. I just have to figure out international shipping. And so thank you guys for listening, and let's get back to the video. But the main plot of this novel, and there really isn't one, is that this monk Mizoguchi becomes obsessed with the Temple of the Golden Pavilion's beauty, this Buddhist temple in Japan. He's like obsessed with it. Like it overtakes him. He dreams about it. This thing becomes the anchor of his entire life. And Mishima inverts our concept of beauty and, Platonic ideals, Aristotelian ideals, a lot of the things we've been taught, and says that beauty isn't comforting, but it rather alienates you. And that's what starts to happen to Mizoguchi, that there's the beauty of this temple compounded by his own self-esteem issues, which probably drive this obsession, start to drive him schizo, and he becomes further and further alienated and starts kind of making more erratic actions, even though there's a nice support group with the monks around him and other citizens in the community who are trying to help him. And it's kind of a good writing in that sense too, that you're watching kind of this downward spiral, shout out 9 Inch Nails, of Mizoguchi, and you can't do anything about it. And you just want to reach out and shake him, and that's what everyone else is doing. And that's what's interesting about sacred objects in general. One could even say that about books, especially very canonical books like the Bible or Paradise Lost or whatever. Eventually it becomes oppressive because it doesn't change. It's perfect. It offers no path of action. There's no way to relieve yourself through it. It just is there, especially with static structures like a building or something like that. But like I said, nonetheless, many pieces of art kind of function similarly for people. And that's why there's like a lot of resentment sometimes toward them. And so Mishima sneaks in this form of nihilism because when you have something that doesn't decay, this temple that has been there for hundreds of years, then when you check out your own life, then you're going to see you're weird, you're clumsy, you do these things even if you don't stutter. And Mishima has some quote that I'm paraphrasing here, that he says that when something becomes beautiful enough, it becomes a crime. And so Mishima is writing a story, not just about some psychologically troubled kid, which is kind of what it is, but our new modern confrontation with our new modern range of emotions and things with beauty. Because maybe you're watching this video right now, this set looks honestly kind of good. Not to toot my own horn, but your phone is beautiful. Like this house is beautiful. Like we've reached through these apps, this technological world I live in is beautiful and perfect. Or it could be equally as grotesque if I wanted it to be. And so as that continues to evolve and our standards and all these things evolve, we have to keep up with that, or we start to have problems. Like, why are so many kids killing themselves because of social media? Well, it's a comparison against what? The unrealistic standard, the highest standard of beauty. Shouldn't that uplift us? Shouldn't we see, some beautiful woman in the mountains in Italy riding a bike and be like, wow, I should really step it up or figure out how to make some more money, or I should, get out and go date or do something and meet a girl like that or whatever. No, a lot of the times, like, damn, this sucks. No one likes me. Like, I look outside my window. I'm in Tucson, Arizona right now, and it's 105 degrees. I can't go outside. Oh, this sucks. And, you can go down that path. And if I never had that referent, those thoughts wouldn't come up as much. If I never had been to Grand Teton National Park, Lake Louise in Canada, all these places, I wouldn't, have this high standard of the alpine meadow. And so when I go to my local mountain and it's just kind of, some pine trees and stuff, I'm like, oh, it's nice. This is great. But you guys kind of get what I'm talking about. And so now we get to this idea, and this is actually kind of relevant to the literary renaissance, and what I'm doing here is that when our job, according to Mishima, as modern artists is to engage in this aesthetic terrorism, that we need to take actions in the world that are more than a crime, and they become art. And that's what happened at the end of Mishima's life. The dummies online, the people who just read a Wikipedia page or who are just, politically polarized in one direction and want to create a narrative, think that Yukio Mishima wanted to have a coup on the government of Japan. That's not true. He was doing aesthetic terrorism. He was doing this final act, this final piece of art in his life that we would talk about forever. You don't overthrow the government of Japan with 4 dudes. Mishima is not he is delusional, he is crazy, but he was not delusional enough to think that talking to a bunch of 18-year-old soldiers outside of barracks and telling them to restore the emperor to the throne was going to work. If anyone has ever talked to anyone who has just gotten into the military, they are mostly young men and women who don't give a crap about that stuff. They are just following orders and going into it. And especially in the post-World War II kind of Reconstruction MacArthur era, which was long past by the time Mishima was doing all that. I mean, the society Mishima was trying to activate really wasn't for that anymore. And if it was in secret. And so he told his 4 companions, and there's actually letters of this and proof, that I don't want you to hurt anybody. If something goes wrong, don't kill anybody. Like, I'll do the crazy stuff. I'll stab someone or do something crazy. But you guys calm down. Me and this other dude are going to do it. That doesn't sound like a coup. That, and I don't know if this is me, it's just like me saying, for the lit bro Japanese lovers, this is like Mishima overthrowing the government's our January 6th. Like, oh my God, this wasn't a coup. And so what Mishima believed, though, is that by doing, this novel is about about this Mizoguchi character. I won't spoil it. Taking the most extreme action to perform this aesthetic terrorism. That what Mishima did was immortalize himself and his art forever. He didn't have to become old. He didn't have to become the fading author. He didn't have to, he would be dead by now, most likely, but he didn't have to be doing interviews and TV and have the paparazzi chase him. He died beautiful. Every single photo we have of him is him looking good and looking awesome. And all of his writing is good. He never fell off the bandwagon or any of these times because he immortalized himself, which our Western conception of suicide, we think it's this terrible thing, but that's what he was trying to do. It's the ultimate thing. But it doesn't just have to be suicide. It can be many other things. And the point is, by destroying something of the highest ideal, then you can preserve it, because eventually everything gets overrun. I mean, honestly, if you've ever liked a band or done a sport and eventually, it got taken over by, everyone else and, commodified and turned into something. I remember starting jiu-jitsu in 2013. I know people who started in the 90s, and I was in Las Vegas, fight capital of the world, and I had to drive 20 minutes for a gym. Now, where I grew up, there are at least 5 gyms within like 5 minutes. Same with freestyle skiing. Anyway, we all have our things, and we've seen it be corrupted. Well, what if you could keep it that way forever? What if you could hold on to whatever that is? And maybe it's not there anymore, but how everyone remembers it is the same forever. And that's kind of this concept that Mishima is exploring in this novel, for better or for worse. And so this is also a nihilistic piece of art. Mishima, at the end of the day, slipped into nihilism. And it's hard not to, because when you look back at the past, in time immemorial, there were real ideals, but many of them, like I said, have all been commodified and thrown away. And other than nature, which has been corrupted also, and here in America, luckily, we still have a lot of public land where you can get away from a lot of the bullshit and the tourists and actually experience it. A lot of it's gone. And so this novel is also a pushback against the cult of the future, because Mishima could see where Japan was going. Mishima could see under the wing of the United States that the hardworking Japanese people, the very intelligent Japanese people, where they were going to go. He was seeing the revolutions in the late 1960s and the socialism and all this stuff. And he was starting to freak out. I mean, Mishima had this idea of this society, this classical society he was very prophetic about where things were going. I'm not a believer necessarily that we're in this overpopulated world. And when you look at Japan's birth rate and how sad those numbers are and the amount of people who aren't in relationships over there, it's wild. And, a lot of that is because of the trauma of their parents and how they were raised. And the work culture, that's a whole other video. But Mishima wanted to reject that direction and take the country back to something transcendent. Because right now, and guys, I'm a fan of anime and everything else, but right now where Japanese culture is at, just as where American culture is at, it is not transcendent. It is sad. Like, I don't want to be negative. Like, people are, oh, why let people do that? You can do your art, but there has to be some form of action. Us continuously becoming less healthy, less happy, less intelligent, and less connected to each other is not a good thing. And the causal factors that drive that are not good things. They can be fine, and I believe that people have the right to consume art, media, drugs, whatever they want without, interference. But nonetheless, I don't need to exist in this toxic positive reality where I cannot sit and say that consuming a bunch of bullshit anime or whatever. And like I said, there's great anime. There's transcendent anime out there that's changed my life. I need to do top 10 anime video, or top 10 manga. This is a literature channel. Anyway, I can't not be called an elitist and not uphold some form of a standard. And I don't know, honestly, I don't know if this classical society that Mishima is talking about, that people get terrified about, this fascist society, sounds bad, and a totalitarian rule sucks. But also living in a world of mediocrity, pure pleasure, pure dopamine, and everyone just compromising on everything, that sounds just as big of a utopian nightmare. But what is the kind of core of Mishima's work and why there's this sad feeling to it, and it's in all of his novels, even like the love stories like The Sound of Waves, is that he knows that we can't go back. His final act was just one of him being an OG. Anyone who actually knows, and I try not to slip into this, but if we keep going the direction we're going, without major change, we are slowly circling the drain and going into the sewer. Right now, there is no awakening happening with anyone. It's a pipe dream. In your little echo chamber, maybe it is. And online, it's really easy to get sucked into those. But the average American, European, or whatever is not moving into deeper states of awareness, knowledge, love, or understanding. We are generally moving away from that. Maybe as a mass collective, because people are gaining literacy and the internet for the first time, that isn't the case. But in the Western world, we definitely are. And Mishima kind of pushes this explores this new self. I was kind of talking about this novel not exactly being a psychological exploration, but Mishima does, in the sense that Mizoguchi in this novel focuses totally on the self, is a narcissist, loses all ability to empathize. And he replaces any ethical categories or contemplation within himself with ethical ones. And we see this now happening with social media, that people, instead of being ethical about what they're putting out online or what they're doing, they care only about the image, the media, the profit, whatever. And this is really going on in the digital spaces with like incels. I know people don't necessarily like that word because, it's kind of been weaponized against men that are socially awkward. But, you guys know what I mean, like the bombastic online personality that in person is socially awkward and weak, but while performing online has this huge grandeur about them. And so Nietzsche in The Will to Power, Friedrich Nietzsche, sorry, we're bringing, Mishima, I have a video if you want to check that out. I think it's called Mishima's Nietzschean novel or something like that. Just go check out the Mishima playlist and there's a title with Nietzsche in it. Mishima was very obsessed with Nietzsche because he saw that the Nietzschean will to power concept and ideology bled into Japanese culture, not just before the war and during the war, but actually after the war, with the kind of pushing of capitalism and dark capital and some of these things. And Nietzsche in The Will to Power says, like I said, I paraphrase a lot of this stuff. I don't, sometimes I pull quotes, but a lot of this comes from my head. Nietzsche basically says that if we want to further ourself, our ego, our position, it's always at the expense of others. And Mishima, in some of his early notes, he says something to the sort of, I'm a demon in the human world. I gobble everyone up. That is my form of affection and being emotional. Like, that's a pretty crazy thing to say as a young man. He wasn't like a 13-year-old edgelord, but like a man when he was writing. A young man, but still. this aligns with kind of the personality in this novel, the sociopathy. And Mishima actually attributed this mindset with the word dojo. You know, the Japanese is a little bit odd here, but he says this mentality of having this coldness, this lack of empathy is like a dojo, which kind of means the place of the way, you know, the place where we meditate or do kendo or jujitsu or whatever. And he said that this mentality is a dojo, which is honestly a really cool way to kind of conceptualize something you're obsessed with or something you're putting out in the world. It's a practice, much like a martial art. But Mishima's practice was detachment. Because he felt like, if you ever read like Confessions of a Mask or anything like that, that emotions and those things get in the way of lucidity. This is a very Western ideal, but something, a hyper-masculine ideal and idea that sometimes, you know, slips into the consciousness of certain people. And when you read Mishima's works, like for instance, this one, The Sailor Who Fell from Grace from the Sea, you see him have his younger characters do these performative things that help them become desensitized, help them become harder in the world, you know, killing cats, beating a pregnant girl, like crazy stuff. And I know that as a young man, I never did anything that extreme, but I did try to desensitize myself. And I know students. So as a high school English teacher, I know people who've done this deeply, who have obviously hurt people, hurt animals, broken people down, but then they've also gone online to the dark web and watched countless people die, animals get killed and other stuff. And I've had to stop so many kids from showing other kids, you know, there's a thing that happens, and it's really sad with technology that, you know, a kid can pull the phone out and say, hey, look at this to another kid, and it's someone's head getting chopped off, and they create a fall from innocence, you know, prematurely. And that's one of the things that you have to realize about public education. Just an FYI, if you're sending your kids there, you have no idea what they're getting shown, and they will never tell you. You know, maybe they will, but then they most likely, if you tell on that kid, will get bullied or be in trouble because they're now the snitch. Unfortunately, maybe you'll get lucky. There are those kids out there, and there are more and more of them every single year because of technology, just trying to screw people up. And so back to Nietzsche, Mizoguchi in this novel cannot be beautiful. He can't be loved by anyone. He's not graceful in his movements. And so, like Nietzsche would say, this is the inversion of slave morality. The one thing that Mizoguchi can be in this novel, and this is actually the case in many Mishima novels, and this is why I love him, because this is something that happens. You know, I recently was talking to an extended family member, and they're living at home still, and they're having trouble kind of getting out of the nest. And they have this very ideal vision of the world, like many young people do. And it's paralyzing them. It's not letting them kind of, you know, make the progress that they need to do, excuse me. And I've been there before. But the one thing that you can have in this world is this purity, is this false sense, this false idealism, this false purity. I see people virtue signal and try to find this all of the time, even in the book world. We all do this in minor ways. And this is called, so if you reverse it, so through negation, through this idea of negation, many people try to get to transcendence. This is kind of the aesthetic or aesthetic mentality of hurting yourself to gain transcendence. And so this novel is about a character, and many Mishima novels, the darker ones at least, are about these characters trying to be reborn through violence, through darkness, through this action. And Murakami, in Mishima's Sea of Fertility tetralogy, it's all about reincarnation, most of the time through some form of violence. And so this novel is an awesome exploration, and I'll stop now. You know, we've been going for a while on this one, on the relationship between narcissism and transcendence, which is a real thing, which is one of the paths to lower level transcendence. You know, most people never obtain any mystical state in their life, never obtain or connect to really any form of transcendence. And there are many paths to getting to the lower levels of transcendence, and negation and evil and those types of things actually can get you there just because you're activating yourself and polarizing in a certain direction. Obviously, getting to the higher levels requires much more dedication, and you can't just, you know, anyway. But I like that this explores that and has that quality, because not many novels, I mean, there are a lot of novels that glorify violence, glorify, you know, this internal mind, this screwed up head or whatever, but they never really hit this transcendent quality. That's something that Dostoevsky did very well, that I think Mishima admired in him. That's why he liked him. Something that Nietzsche talked about, and it's something that I think is missing in a lot of our negative literature now, that it's kind of just a circle jerk over, how evil we can be, or how deep in the mind or schizophrenic or hallucinatory or psychedelic this can get, instead of, doing the ping pong of negating to hit something higher or hit some form of transcendent or descendant quality. And so I recommend this novel. Hopefully I've convinced you to read it. It's really good. I recommend the Sea of Fertility tetralogy. Also, like I said, Runaway Horses is probably his best work, but who knows, maybe you guys don't share that opinion of Mishima, but he deserves for sure to be on this list. And so next I'm going to pull the book off the shelf that has been sitting there. And as you guys can see, there are books behind books holding books up. We have Musashi by Yoshikawa. And if I reach up here, and I'm now creating noise, I also like Taiko, I think its name is. There's always some pronunciation person in the chat that can help me. I really butcher Japanese names. By Yoshikawa. I actually like both of these. I may like Taiko over here a little bit more, but we're going to talk about Musashi because I feel like talking about Musashi and studying his journey and all of that is a little bit more relevant to the modern person, reading the Book of Five Rings, reading about him, embodying that mentality, I think is really kind of an important thing. And one of the main things that we can learn from, the Japanese samurai culture and actually take some of that stuff with us. Anybody, men, women, people of all different walks of life can get something from that. But as you start to go deeper into like Japanese culture, just like any culture, it becomes less and less inclusive, which is fine. But, I like to talk about novels that I can give to most people. And if they are at least a reader, they can get something big from it. And so let's talk about Musashi. So the first thing I want to say about Yoshikawa's writing, and maybe it's just a translation thing, but I can tell, having read these two books, is that these are big novels. I don't know how many pages we have here. It's somewhat small text. I mean, this is like 900 pages, and this one's also super long. So these are big novels, but in actuality, the writing isn't very hard. The writing is very simple. Like Mishima has these flourishes and has all this beauty in his work. Some of the other authors we're talking about do. There are other Japanese authors that are more experimental. And when I first saw these books and saw the covers, over a decade ago, I thought of samurai and and like I thought it'd be crazy. I thought it'd feel like an action film. But in actuality, it's a slow kind of meandering meditation. Sometimes it can be dull, but what's good about that and why I like that is that serious readers won't have a problem with that. And beginner readers who approach this it's going to increase the chance that you're going to be able to finish this. I think that being able to read something that's 900 pages, over 200,000 words is a really beautiful experience because you can get more out of it. Novels that are 900 pages have a higher chance of being a top 10 novel than a novel that's 150 pages because there's just more time for you to make it good. There's also more time for you to destroy it. But Yoshikawa can holds it together, and it never really feels like a slog. It feels like as you read this, you keep a momentum. And I've known actually a lot of people who have finished this novel, like a lot of, I would say, non-serious readers, readers who aren't into too much literary fiction, maybe read 5 books a year, who have read Musashi before. I did jujitsu for years, and I knew a lot of guys that have read this who didn't read anything else. And so that's kind of a hallmark for me, not to be like Wordsworth or something, that a novel that can be read by the common man or by a normal person and change them and they enjoy it and it's about a real topic, that means something. So this novel is basically the epic and the archetype of the warrior ideal in Japan, the warrior archetype. Miyamoto Musashi, who was a real person living in the 16th and 17th century, not only was he's not just some killing machine, but at the start of the book, we see his wildness, him being unrestrained. And the novel's great because it's a really great example of good characterization. Musashi's journey in general is that, like many samurais were. But over the course of this novel, we see this beautiful transformation of this wild youth who's challenging people and, killing them in duels, to this man who has a deep philosophy, who has restraint, who has mastered the self. There is more than one path to the top of the mountain. And the samurai ethos in general is the warrior poet, right? Someone who does protect and does serve as a loyal servant, of their master, but they also have this inward side, and many of the older samurai were, mentors to the youth and like very important staples of the community. And, that's one of the reasons why in the late 19th century, when the samurai were, axed, that they not only got rid of this warrior class, quote unquote, but also that's one, it made it easier for the Japanese imperial mindset to kind of, start to rage out a little bit more when you hand people machine guns and, everyone can be a part of the war. Then it's easier to have this unrestrained philosophy, especially if you manipulate, like the Hagakure or whatever it's called, that Forrest Whitaker's reading right here, that was used by the Japanese as this like negative thing to promote imperialism. So this is kind of a great coming of age novel that basically combines everything together, like myth, history, literature. And I forgot to mention that this was a pulp, novel that was serialized. This is, Yoshikawa wrote a lot of genre stuff. And so that's just one thing to remember here. And so this is also a spiritual manual. That's great. And another thing that I want to praise about Yoshikawa is he helped recreate kind of the image of the samurai for the modern world. These novels were actually a big deal. Over here in the West, we don't have, I'm trying to think like The Great Gatsby. I mean, maybe someone down below can tell me, but we don't have as old of a culture either. The reimagining of something for modern consumption is a really big deal, especially when it's one of the most important parts of the culture. And so boom, got to talk about Musashi. I 100% recommend this novel. Daniele Bolelli over at History on Fire, which is a history podcast, one of my favorites. He did a series on Musashi. That's available for free if you want to get more of a perspective from a historian on the story that can talk about some of the more extravagant, exaggerated, most likely untrue stories. But will tell you that, that's kind of one of the problems with Musashi is that the source material is somewhat sparse. He did write, when we have writings from him, but he very rarely kind of mentions his life or like certain circumstances and details. So we have to kind of put it all together. It's kind of wild. And so this novel is somewhat of a reach, but nonetheless, I absolutely love it. So I know this next pick is going to cause some rumblings. And if you scroll down to the comments below, there's going to be a logic bro. Kazuo Ishiguro is not Japanese. Well, this is my list. And Kazuo Ishiguro was born in Japan and wrote novels about Japan. And if I want to loosen the definition a little bit, I think he can be included. And I think this novel should be included on this list because it is one of the best pieces of Japanese literature, even though it was written in English about Japan, ever written. This novel deals with one of the most important topics in Japanese history, better than anybody else, which is what happens after World War II. Because World War II happens, right? And, oh, wait, we're the good guys, right? You come home from World War II and as an American, you killed a bunch of Germans, people of all countries, every single country raped people and stole stuff and did a bunch of crazy stuff. But let's say you did everything bad. But you come home as an American and you're celebrated. Like if you went all the way and you did all that, men will be men. We're the victors of the war. We get to write the history. Cool. But over in Japan, what happens to the losers? And as the losers of the war, the people who were in the deepest, pushing the mentality, how are they treated after the war? And how do they grapple with it? And so An Artist of the Floating World is about an artist who was one of the lead propaganda artists for Japan, like doing art for propaganda. How you've seen American art before that was propaganda. Well, just like in America, Japan recruited some of the best artists to create art to basically make the Japanese people go crazy and want to, stay bonsai and kill themselves and be kamikaze, all that stuff. And speaking of going crazy, I have a second channel, everyone, where I talk about writing, where I help you get better at writing and show you how to get your writing out to people who care. It's my passion project. It's called The Literary Renaissance. And if you are a writer or want to get into writing or want to hear about the writing industry and what's going on over there, then I can guarantee you that channel is different than anybody else's over on WritingTube. And so your support would mean a lot. I mean, it's free content. And I'm going to be posting over there a ton starting very, very soon. So I would love to see you guys over there. The link is down in the description below, right next to the Substack link. So go check it out. And so how do you grapple with that? That once you've maybe gotten out of the fog, once you've reoriented as a society and Douglas MacArthur is there, and now you have this new mentality, how do you grapple with the people that got you into this shit? Because it's not just we think of Tojo or, all these people at the top, the emperor, all these people, but what about the people like a little bit down, a couple ranks down who have now reintegrated back into society? And how do they reintegrate? And so Kazuo Ishiguro is one of the masters of the unreliable narrator. And what he does in this novel is get us in the head of this artist who after the war is now living in this weird world. Because another thing that happens after a world war is that, okay, we have this mentality like Mishima or all these people, we go and we fight and we sacrifice everything. Does it just change overnight? Do you just say, okay, we've lost and everyone just accepts it? A lot of people did that actually, especially in Japan, even in Germany. It was somewhat fast. There was obviously a lot of resistance and people who resisted, but there was a somewhat fast shift because you just kind of had to. So people kind of got over it. There were other people though who kind of were idealistic about that time, longing, especially people in power, people who didn't have to go to war, people who maybe didn't lose as much in the war in terms of family members or some of these things, and had prominence because of the war. Because when there's a war happening, especially when you're being successful, especially like the campaign into Manchuria and stuff, you're kind of a bigwig. But then after, and once you've lost that status, how do you grapple with that? And so this artist in this is, an older man. And for a while in the novel, we don't, it's a small spoiler here, we don't necessarily know what he was and why everyone's treating him this way. But his son and everyone in the novel is treating him bad. And this novel kind of slowly opens up. And Ishiguro, as I was saying, is the best at unreliable narration. You kind of see the problems. You see this guy's wicked mentality. You see all these problems and you see why people are treating him like this, and you're seeing him justify it. And the writing in here is spectacular. Like I said, because this didn't have to go through translation, all the beauty is still there, and like I said, it's a little bit unfair, but I don't really care. I'm making the list and I'm trying to deliver you guys good novels that are going to change your life. And 90% of you, 99% of you guys speak English. And so I'm going to deliver this to you because this isn't disconnected from Japan. Ishiguro wrote his first couple novels about Japan, and I feel like was very connected to what was going on there. And so this is a very artistic novel. This is, like I said, one of the best examples of unreliable narration of any novel ever. And if you're a fan of Japan and, like I said, the world wars and the reconciliation after, this is a must read because Ishiguro isn't scared. He isn't scared to have characters that are bigots, biased, all of this stuff. And so I very much support this novel, love this novel. And like I said, it really starts making you ask these questions and like kind of contemplate this, because that transition definitely is not an easy one. And like I said, for some people, it's much, much harder. And so shout out Kazuo Ishiguro. So next we have Kobo Abe's The Woman in the Dunes. And I should say about Kazuo Ishiguro, like many of these authors, I have a playlist on him. I've done, I think, 10 videos or so. I do have a video on Kobo Abe. It's actually surprisingly creative writing video. I read one of his books that were like essays, letters, some of that type of stuff. Like I said, I'm kind of a Japanese literature nerd. And so I compiled for the first time, I think, in internet history, Kobo Abe's writing advice. So just type in Kobo Abe Write Conscious and you will find that one if you're interested in him. And so we have The Woman in the Dunes. And this is just a weird novel. I mean, this is basically about a dude that gets thrown into this sand dune, the bottom of the sand dune he can't get out of with this woman, and they just have to like pale out sand or something all day, or like mine. I can't remember exactly. And it's kind of a psychological thriller in that sense that there's this dude and he's trapped. There's good interiority, and it turns into a very symbolic novel because they're just trapped at the bottom of this dune and he can't get out. He can't escape. And how do you grapple with that? How do you grapple with basically being stuck forever and becoming a slave, especially in the modern world? And so this somewhat reads like The Stranger at some level. It's like, it feels like The Stranger, but with more interiority. And it is a very kind of existential novel. And it's interesting because I could see parallels to like the myth of Sisyphus, but I feel like Abe rebuilds existentialism for Japanese people, because like we have this Western concept of existentialism, but we don't get Camus' humanism. There is no freedom through rebellion in this. There's more of the actual reality of existentialism in that mentality for most of us, which isn't this grandiose thing unless you're a 20-year-old fuckhead, just like, womanizing and like being that type of existentialist. But instead, we get adaptation, we get The Stand, we get The Dune, we get just this endless drag. And so this is kind of a big symbol, allegory to modern society. This hole that they're in is modern society. The people keeping him in there are the norms. The woman he's with, and working with down there is the illusion of love. And the sand and all of that is basically just capitalism and bureaucracy. And so this is, speaking, it's actually all kind of ascending really well. This is Abe kind of talking about life in capitalism in, post-war Japan. And kind of how the Japanese, like I said, they took it up really well. Japan's economy, especially for a while, for the population and for what it was extremely strong. Still a really strong economy. But anyway, this is an interesting book because it basically it shows the horror of conformity in a really kind of symbolic and cool way. So I love this. If you're into absurdism, like I said, anything related to Camus or existentialism, this is like book one that you need to be reading from this list. So next we have the man, the myth, the legend himself, of course, Haruki Murakami. And my favorite novel by him, and I think the most complete, if you want to kind of a one-ticket punch to most of his concepts, is Kafka on the Shore. Because after Kafka on the Shore and the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, he started to write in more third person, if I remember correctly, starting with 1Q84, which is something that he's kind of continued. And I really feel like his first person stuff is better. But what's interesting about this is his transition to the third person. So for almost all of Murakami's initial novels, he was writing in the first person, and this is where he really started to experiment with the third, and I like kind of the blending of the two with him. So that's just a quick nerdy note, but Murakami really embodies, and like I said, I'm not an expert on Japanese culture or any of these things, and people online are like, oh, Murakami, he's just, Japanese literature for white people. But I know people from Japan. I've actually met a lot of them, and they all like him. The only people that don't like Murakami that I know are just lit bros, like logic bros a lot of the time, or just like really like triggered women who like can't get over him talking about breasts or having like underage sex scenes. Like those are the only people, or there are people like, oh, it's just kind of boring, it's not my thing. But in general, the only people that hate him are those archetypes. And the people I know from Japan who've read him, which I'm jealous that they generally like him. And so if you don't know, Haruki Murakami is a author of, one could say, magical realism, surrealism, and many of his novels have these male protagonists who are coming of age, and they get there most of the time through some form of synchronicity, magic, and working with a female character. And Kafka on the Shore is about a young man named Kafka who has run away from home, and he ends up in this town that, with some magical qualities, and the novel breaks open. There's talking cats. There's a mentally handicapped dude that can talk to cats. Colonel Sanders, the Kentucky Fried Chicken guy, makes an appearance as a manifestation of spirit. There are ghosts. There are surreal scenes in a forest. There's good ocean mythology. There's chat on discussions on literature, because eventually Kafka is like living or spending all of his time in a library. It's a beautiful coming of age novel. It's one of the better modern Japanese coming of age novels that I've read. I've only read like 10, but for sure this one is one of the best. I mean, when I read Murakami, it really feels like literature. It really feels like what it's supposed to be. It isn't trying to mentally show off to me. He's not trying to be anything. He's just writing a good story with a hopeful thread of optimism within it, but that can also be violent and crazy sometimes. It also explores the shadow side. Like literally in this novel, the main character is kind of in dialogue with the shadow side. And so this is why I would recommend this one, because it really throws together some of the best elements of literature. Like this is, in my opinion, in my top 25 of books written in the 21st century, if not my top 10. I mean, I absolutely love this novel. As you guys can maybe see, I am very optimistic. I'm spiritual. And so if that kind of resonates with you, then I think Murakami is the dude for you. So next on the list, we have The Tale of the Genji, which is one of the best classic novels and for sure one of the best like early classics of all time. This was written in the 11th century, everyone. Can you get down with that? The 11th century, Jesus Christ. And this is one of the first psychological novels of all time. And it really connects. I mean, I just want to, did you hear me? The 11th century. That's like a millennia before Proust. That's hundreds of years before Boccaccio, Chaucer, Shakespeare, so many others. And why I like this novel and why I think in context with some of the other novels we're talking about is that there seems to be this theme in Japanese culture, especially with aesthetics. You know, aesthetics really weren't that big of a deal. I mean, you could go read Tolstoy's What is Art, and obviously you can go read Aristotle and his theories on aesthetics and all of that, but things really didn't ramp up until like the 1700s in terms of like aesthetic theory in the West. And obviously there's offshoots, and like I said, we had Western philosophy with the Greeks and stuff, but I feel like the Japanese in terms of an artistic level, on the artistic side, have really thought about it more than we maybe did. That could just be a bias. But for instance, I didn't even really mention this with The Artist of the Floating World, but it's about art. It's about the impermanence of art, and it's very surreal at times. Like I didn't even talked about that. And so this is like the fourth book we've talked about where aesthetics are a big deal, and we're not even done with the list yet. Because in Japanese cultures, there's this idea of mono no aware, which is the pathos of things, which is the impermanence of beauty that, you know, later Mishima starts to invert and corrupt. And so throughout much of Japanese art, there's this idea and this focus on these almost pseudo Eastern ideas, you know, and that's another thing about the East that can help make it more melancholic, that somehow even in cultures that hadn't been exposed to Buddhism yet, for instance, like Buddhism became a much bigger deal in Japan until about the 6th century is when it got introduced. But it wasn't until this period that Buddhism became a part of the ruling class and the nobility in all different parts of society. And one of the cool things about Buddhism is that it actually can produce a lot of melancholy, because this idea that attachment leads to suffering is kind of a wild thing, because when you kind of adopt that into your mind, you see the impermanence of, for instance, the seasons. You know, there's a lot of talk in here about the cherry blossoms and the women that some people love. They come and go like the seasons. And Genji himself, the author, almost becomes this vehicle of impermanence and transcendence and all of these things. And it's some of the, you know, it's these Eastern ideas that are being explored much further and more in depth than what people in the West are doing with Christianity. And people get so mad when I think it's mostly just Christians who like freak out, but it's like the West was exploring things that the East wasn't exploring also. It's just how it is. And obviously people in the West were exploring attachment and some of these things, but there are levels to the game. By the time East met West, the West still didn't have and still doesn't have a strong system of obtaining mystical states, as the East had figured out asana, pranayama, samadhi, vipassana meditation, all this crazy stuff, and had manuals on it. They had figured that out by the medieval era. And we're still trying to get Joe Schmoes to stop watching football and wake up. Jesus Christ. Why detach when you can just attach to football in your fantasy league and just get sucked in forever? You can have anxiety every single day. Like, oh my God, Justin Jefferson is hurt. Instead of having anxiety about being asleep your whole life and your oncoming death, you can worry about your waiver selections. Anyway, don't get me wrong though. I love professional sports. It's WWE. It's reality TV for men. You know, guys make fun of women. They say, oh, you guys watch the Kardashians. You just sit and doom scroll each day as they're playing video games and watching the reality TV sports network. And so this is also a great novel because it has a ton of interiority before interiority really became a big thing, before people like Jane Austen broke it open. And it's funny that it's been mostly women that have, like, you know, even in modernism and stuff, women have like really helped push the limits of interiority all throughout history in terms of literature and poetry, which is probably because of their social standing in those times and not being able to go out. So they had to go on this more internal journey. But nevertheless, Really good stuff. And so this is a long novel. This can be a slog. This isn't for the faint of heart, but if you are interested in Japanese culture, ikuna, and literature and ideas, like I said, it's fun to see this all connect together, especially with a sense of detachment as a Westerner, because by the time we get to Mishima, he's writing his Sea of Fertility tetralogy, and he's like destroying Buddhism. He's talking about how it's a transplant and how, he's trying to revive Shintoism and stuff like that. So next we have Kenzaburo Oe, sorry, however you want to say it. And this guy is an absolute heat slinger when it comes to Japanese literature. When I think, as a reader who's been educated in like Western classics and literature, philosophy, it's hard not to make comparisons across the board. But I feel like Oe is the Faulkner of Japan. This one, A Personal Matter, his other novel, The Silent Cry, they are dark and dense novels. This is, one of the more literary fiction pieces that is modern, because something that's interesting about literature in general is the stop that World War II kind of put on literature. Because it's interesting because we look at the modernist era and modernist writers and what is in that in-between period, because when we look at most literary movements, they do last a couple decades, but modernism really kicked off in the literal 1900s, like 1900 and 1910, and then continued for a couple decades. Then we kind of transitioned into World War II, which was kind of a lull period, not just for Japanese modernism, but American modernism. And then after the war, we kind of moved into this weird existential era that was still modernist and that sometimes had this more spiritual bent to it, but hadn't transcended into postmodernism or experimental or whatever else comes after modernism yet. And so A Personal Matter by Oe, I would say, falls into that. A lot of his work is more in this Japanese, not postmodernism, but post-war modernism, which is this is literary nerd territory, which I really enjoy. I enjoy poetry from like 1955 to 1950 to 1965 that isn't even necessarily beat stuff. And same with literature. I feel like it's one of the best times because it's that nice in-between period where we were grappling with the trauma and this new world, the anxieties of technology, but many of the authors who were at their peak were born into the old world, had that intensity. They also had the freedom to write pretty crazy. And that's what I view this novel as. I view A Personal Matter as the kind of outer dark of Japan. It's literally about that. And if you don't know Outer Dark, it's by Cormac McCarthy. And much like Outer Dark, it was a confession. So Cormac McCarthy, with his famous novel Outer Dark, which is going to be adapted very soon, started writing it literally. And we're talking about it in the book club tomorrow, and I recently got access to the first draft, the only first draft that we have of Cormac McCarthy ever. Someone had scanned it at the archive and sent it to me, and I read through it. But he started it literally when him and his wife were getting divorced. He had his first wife and they had a kid. And anyway, the month of their divorce, he started it. And it's this novel about a brother and sister who have this incest baby, and the brother leaves it in the woods. And there's this whole, aftermath of all of that. But Oe's son, very similarly, was born with a brain hernia. And instead of writing a tribute or like a nice novel about his son who had this problem, he instead wrote a novel about wanting to kill his kid and then run away. And so this is a great exploration of the post-war man, of this modernist man, this modernist image that is broken after the war, this spiritually hollow, detached man. And it is a bleak novel. Most of his works are very, very dark. But I like this because it's life. Many of these novels we've been talking about are from the classical era or magical like Murakami, political. But this one is the most grounded in reality that we've talked about so far. And so I do recommend most of his works. And like I said, if you're looking for heavy, dark, grotesque works from Japan that are literary and aren't like genre horror, then this is your man. So next we have No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. And this is a really fun discussion to have about Japanese literature because Osamu Dazai, in terms of viewing him compared to Mishima, they seem like polar opposites, especially at the end of their life. But they actually met. And apparently Mishima said of Dazai that the disgust in which I hold Dazai's literature is in some way ferocious. First, I dislike his face. Second, I dislike his rustic preference for urban sophistication. Third, I dislike the fact that he played roles that were not appropriate for him. And so he apparently said that to Dazai's face, but apparently they liked each other and, they hated each other, but also kind of had this working relationship. And Mishima said that Dazai talked to him about suicide and it changed his whole perspective on it. And so Dazai is an interesting dude. He was an alcoholic, a drug addict. He was a womanizer. He was basically a serial piece of shit when it came to women. He attempted suicide he convinced some girl very early in his life when I think he was like 19 years old to commit suicide with them, and they jumped into the ocean and he ended up living. I shouldn't laugh. And she ended up dying. And then I'm only laughing because then later on at the end of his life, he did it again. He convinced this girl to throw himself in the river with him. And that time they both ended up dying. But Dazai, in my opinion, is like almost a very similar thing to what Mishima was doing with Life for Sale, which I actually don't have here right now. Confessions of a Mask and a lot of his earlier work. He was doing these explorations of the internal world in a deep way, like these deep confessionals, which Mishima somewhat saw as a cheap trick, even though he ended up doing it. But he always injected more philosophy than Dazai did. And so this novel is about a character who is an alcoholic, a drug addict, obsessed with suicide, and can't authentically connect with others. And so these novels are somewhat great when there's kind of a psychopath writing them because they're just kind of expressing themselves. You go to a writer's circle, right, or a writer's group, and, someone writes about their experiences with domestic violence or this, and it's good some of the time, but a lot of the time it's somewhat half-baked. But imagine being a total psychopath and you're talented and you work hard, and all that comes together perfectly. And that's what kind of Dazai is doing in the Japanese realm. These guys do it so much better than many of the Western authors who kind of go internally because they aren't afraid, to be philosophical, to go kind of beyond the first layer, and they don't get caught in sensuality or psychedelic stuff or too much into the sex. They stay detached from a lot of that, which is why I prefer a lot of this literature more than its Western counterpart. And this novel is one of the early kind of threads of the anxiety, the depression, and the terror that many of the authors felt after the war. When earlier I was talking about what happens when everything changes and you have to make this big transition, but as a society, even the common man had to deal with the loss of the emperor's divinity. They really believe that. Like, we think it's like really dumb now that they believe this dude was like a divine figure, but they did. The country was also dealing with the disintegration of their traditions and their conception of like men and women. Women were starting to enter the workforce, and then having to deal with just being defeated and like going on this campaign and killing people and like basically having to be babysat by the Americans for a couple decades. We're still babysitting them over on Okinawa. And so this one I think needs to make the list because it created a springboard for everyone else in Japanese culture to write like this. And Americans were obsessed with it because, as I was saying, we didn't really have people doing this, Later on in the 50s and 60s, we started to get into this, but the Japanese were ahead of us, especially in terms of technical ability. And we're reading this in translation, which is wild. And so I recommend many of Dazai's novels. He is a very talented author. And so go check this one out. So next we have Yasunari Kawabata's Thousand Cranes. And I just want to mention really fast for short story lovers out there, my favorite work by Kawabata is his Palm of the Hand stories, which is some of the better short stories ever written, especially in Japan, maybe outside of Patriotism by Mishima. And so if you're interested, go check that out. But we're talking about novels here. And A Thousand Cranes is very antithetical, or on the opposite side of the aisle, of what many of the novels we've been previously talking about we're trying to do in kind of this post-World War II mania. We have the existentialism of Abe. Dazai and Mishima are verbose and kind of oversharing when it comes to their confessions. But A Thousand Cranes is more in the realm of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, not in terms of the length and because this is only 150 pages. This is one of the shorter novels that I will be mentioning today. And so if you want to just get into Japanese literature and read something that's good, this is a good place to start. But Kawabata is a much more minimal writer compared to many of the others we've been talking about, and isn't as detached. He detaches in a different way. So in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, she does something genius. She shows restraint throughout the novel. Many of the characters, while being confronted or whatever, show restraint, and that's actually one of the main drivers of characterization. Well, Japanese culture is also very heavy with restraint, being polite, many of these things. And so I feel like Kawabata drew from people like Jane Austen and others, and obviously just from Japanese culture. And this is a much more traditional novel. We have rituals like the tea ceremony. There are more Shakespearean characters and tragic falls. But once again, this novel deals with beauty. I mean, it's crazy, you guys, how almost all these novels, and maybe it's just me, are really dealing with aesthetics. This novel feels more longing than Mishima and some of the others. They have a much more nihilistic view. This one is just more pointing out our spiritual decay, that, we had this beautiful system of tradition that would heal us or help us, and it's no longer there. And it's just all subtly pointed out, which I like, a short novel that can get to the point. And so that's why I think that Thousand Cranes by Kawabata deserves to be on this list. And like I said, I would check out some of his short stories or this one if you're just trying to get some fast and quick action in. And just a quick note, this isn't a novel, but everyone, if you were into Japanese culture or stories, you got to go check out Rashomon and 17 Other Stories. This was the inspiration for so many authors. Mishima, Kurosawa films, so many great pieces of art in Japanese literature were inspired by these short stories. And so if you're into the samurai and anything like that, then just make sure to check this one out. So last but not least, we have Kokoro by Natsume Soseki, if I am saying that correctly. So I love this one, and I think it may be my favorite novel that's set in the Meiji era. Many of these novels we've been talking about have been post-World War II or modern novels, or maybe a little bit before World War II, but this one takes place at the turn of the century, which for anyone who's studied history knows that was just such a tumultuous time in Japan, and for sure the most interesting time across Japanese history, because we have this classic culture ending and then them integrating this Western culture plus technology and everything else, and radical politics and ideas and spirituality, all this stuff coming up. I mean, it's crazy that many countries took a century to do the process that Japan did in a couple decades. And when you go fast, sometimes it's awesome and you make big changes, but there's a lot of stuff that needs time to change. And then when you move fast, it's just this weird kind of underbelly that is this unconscious energy, which a lot of the time can be really negative. And so this is a modernist novel that is in line with what kind of many people were doing with these stream of consciousness psychological novels at the time. And this novel is written as a suicide note. Like, oh my God, how much have we talked about that this episode? And this is about a man stuck between the two worlds, these two moral worlds. This new Western world and the traditional world. And like I said, unlike many of the other novels we've talked about, this is much earlier in the process where the old world was still more present. It wasn't people just trying to call it back. And so this is actually one of the more popular novels in Japan for students to read. This could be called their Great Gatsby. But could you imagine reading this in high school? Like what we read in high school over here in the West, 1984, Animal Farm, Fahrenheit 451, love them. But they are kind of weak sauce. Like if I was reading this in high school and this was considered the classic, I'd be like, holy crap. And then I'd question, like, no wonder we have the highest suicide rate. And so, yes, I 100% recommend this novel if you are into more minimal, consciousness-driven modernism. And there it is, everyone. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you guys for all the support. If you want to support this channel, obviously, once again, you can go join the book club and get access to all my courses. You can go check out my second channel, or just leave a comment, say hello, tell me what I missed, and I will see you guys very soon in the next video.